Welcome to the Data Leadership Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Algmin. Data is everywhere in our businesses, and it takes leadership to make the most of it. We bring you the people, stories, and lessons to help you become a data leader. We've partnered with Dataversity to provide listeners with 20% off your first training center purchase with promo code AlgminDL. Go to dataleadershiptraining.com to learn more. Today on episode 99, we welcome Raj Bains. Raj is the founder and CEO of Prophecy. Previously, Raj led project management of Apache Hive at Hortonworks through their IPO. He also headed product management and marketing for a NewSQL database startup. Raj, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm delighted to be here.
We're delighted to have you. So please take a few minutes and just give us kind of that story overview of your career and how those earlier experiences led you to doing what you do now.
Sure, that sounds good. So I started off in engineering, where a lot of us do. So this is early 2000s. We are transitioning. I started off a little bit in graphics. We are transitioning from graphics becoming programmable for the first time, where you could write a little bit of code to say how lighting would be and how textures would be. So that was exciting times, video games. Then I moved on to the world of compilers. Now, compilers is what makes the code run on hardware. So I was at Microsoft. I worked in the Visual Studio team. It used to be the coolest development tool for the engineers back then.
And my language, I used to use Visual Studio. I love it.
Yeah, and we would be like trying to make Windows code go faster. And that was like, and then, you make a mistake somewhere and in the middle of the boot up, the machine crashes. It's like, how do I even debug that? There's no machine running. So a lot of joy. But then I had this professor come from UIUC who told me, hey, NVIDIA is saying we want to build a language like C on top of graphics cards or GPUs so that you can run other things. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. So I moved to NVIDIA and I worked on a lot of the compilers for what is CUDA. And that was the second transition where you went from graphics to being able to do anything on GPUs. And I stayed there for a few years, but now all the Bitcoin mining, all the deep learning, all of that runs on GPUs, and I was in the initial team that built that stack. And from there, I moved on to data. So that was my transition to data, first as an engineer, then into marketing, and then into product management for Hive. And the big realization was these the tools of their data practitioners. It's like they really suck. I'm like, we've been building some really sophisticated stuff there, and they've got some application users building some simple tools, and all these guys are struggling. And I'm like, we've got to fix this. This is what I'm doing for the next 10 years. We are going to make the data tools better, like bring them into the future. So that's what I'm working on. We're super excited about it.
So is that what Prophecy does? Is that
Yes.
You're building data tools for database developers?
Yeah. So for people building data pipelines. So they've been saying data is the new oil for a decade now, right? And then you ask them, hey, what have you done with data? It's like, oh, all our machine learning engineers are trying to prepare data and spending 90% of the time there. I'm like, that sounds good. And now 10 years later, what's going on? It's like, we are doing the exact same thing. Nothing's moving. So what we do is we help companies build data pipelines that get data from all your operational systems, get it into data warehouses, put it in the right shape for business analysts and for the machine learning folks to ask the right questions. So these data pipelines run every day for every, and in a large business, they would have tens of thousands of them.
Sure. So is Prophecy then is a product and a consultative offering, or is it product service? Or
it's a product. So basically what happens is, what happened is that a lot of people looked at the Googles of the world, right? And who started coding everything and said that's the right way to go. And it turns out if you are building data pipelines, that's not the right way to go. You can just build these pipelines visually. A data analyst can build them and do 90% of the work of what would be a data engineer. So now what has happened is these people have been struggling a little bit, where they're contorting the entire organization, So where, let's say I have a credit card business. I understand the credit card data. Now, if I have to transform that data, I go to the central IT team, to a person who does not understand anything about my credit card data, but does understand the technology and the code, and say, you modify it. And then they'll put me in a queue and say, okay, come back after a month. So we are just looking at it and saying, no, 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 that's the wrong way to go about it. Here, data analyst, line of business, data scientist, whoever is in the business who understands the data very well, here is a visual drag and drop interface for you. Easily, you build data pipelines. We, in our product, take those visual pipelines, convert them to high quality code. Spark, SQL, whatever, make it run at scale on large data platforms. So basically, what it does is it takes every analyst, every data scientist who can do some visual drag and drop and expressions, and makes them into a solid data engineer. So they can get that part of their work done very quickly and get to the analytics and machine learning that they were hired to actually do.
Okay, so I'd be remiss if I didn't play a little devil's advocate in your
Yes.
in your approach here, because what I've seen in the past, and I'm sure you'll have an answer for this, but what I've seen in the past when, I think, back to some of the visualization tools like the Tableaus or what have you, where every analyst can go end to end on the pipeline, bring your source data in and do whatever you need to, and then you can do your analytics or whatever visualizations right on top of it. And what ended up happening there is the same problem that we've seen in Excel for a million years, and that is the sprawl of disconnected objects and files and what have you. Each analyst does their own thing, but there's no cohesion to any of it, and so nothing ends up working well together. And that's what I fear when I hear what you're explaining. I'm like, that sounds great, except I see there is still, at least from my experience, some need for, you already know your answer, which is great, because I could see it in your face. But
You can see it in my face.
I can see it in your face. But so what I'm saying though is that what scares me about this is that there is a need for sharing these things across, and having, there's a reason that data modeling exists. There's a reason why data architecture exists, to create, especially for these large organizations, some consistency across that user community of how things are being normed. How do you address that? And how can you evolve beyond that? Because I don't think anybody, like, I hear your story. Nobody likes that circumstance where you're like, hey, the business knows exactly what they want to do with the data. They hand it over to technology to muck with for a month. If you're lucky, it's only a month,
Yes.
to then do something that then comes back to them. And they're like, this isn't what we wanted. This isn't what we had. Like, that's a broken system. We can all agree on that. But how do you address some of these things that I'm raising?
Yeah, and this is very real. I think the good thing is we went and worked with some of the largest customers as our design partners early on, and we are like, oh, we are going to solve the full problem. So I have a good answer for you. So what we do is two different things. So first is, if let's say I'm an expert in customer data, not only can I create a data set, right? I'll get the data, clean the data, connect it with, demographic data, customer data, all of that. And now I'm like, this is my source of truth to the data. Now I can publish that. I can say, here, I publish that, and then everybody else in the organization can search whenever they're looking for customer data. They can look at the data set I produced. They know who produced it. Okay, this is the right customer team. This is the data quality. This is the freshness, and this is how each column was computed. It's with lineage. So we provide that. So there is a publish subscribe mechanism and a search mechanism. So that is one part of the story. The second part of the story is, our product is extensible, but extensible means, it's actually, extensibility is the product. It's a little hard to explain, but let's say there is some visual components that our product comes with. Now data engineers in other organizations can write their own. So they can say, here is in every developer's visual environment, there should be a menu item called security. And within that, there should be this visual operator for anonymization, this for encryption, and this. So they can publish their own standards all the way, going from simple transforms to say, this is how you do it, to writing to their own other systems that you need to write to templates for productionization. You can, there's these subgraphs, and this is like, this is how the logging will happen. This is how, if the pipeline breaks, in the middle of the night, this is who the message should go out to. So what we have is a mechanism for the data platform team to build standards and controls, which means standards in business transformation, standards in operationalization, and standards in access control, and then go publish those standards to the what are called the domain data teams, the teams who understand their data, and they can assist them. So we've kind of built it in a way in which both of these teams interact through the product, right? So we are saying we want it's the yin and yang problem, right? You want these people to go fast with self-serve. At the same time, you want standardization, you want controls, you want quality. So we are kind of working on balancing that with some of our largest customers, and this interplay is hard to get right. But I think every organization kind of finds their own mean. But it's like whatever balance you want, you can do it with our product.
That makes sense. I like the idea of leveraging some templates. And if I'm hearing you correctly, I would interpret these templates as being a way that we can create somewhat like extensible data models or standards around the data modeling of like how should the data be formed and what we're going to bring that data to. We can become more collaborative with this, and
Yes.
we can better integrate the business side knowledge that can be really should be driving these models to begin with, but can do so with more kind of a hands-on nature from those business folks themselves. Is this correct, or am I missing something here?
This is exactly correct. So the just to rearticulate it in a few more words, the data platform team should not be in the business of building data pipelines for the line of business. Sometimes, okay, if the data is used by everybody in the company, you can do that, right? Some data might be like that. But for the most part, they should be in the role of enabling them. How do you enable them? You enable them with templates, just like you said. It's like this is the standard of how you do it, right? Business templates, productionization templates, right? And you so setting the standards where if they need something that's not there, they can come back to the data platform team and say, hey, I need a standard way to do this, and they're like, here you go, standard way. It's like teaching people how to fish, right? Or
Yeah.
giving them the tools to fish rather than doing fishing for them. So very aligned with you. It's very template heavy. It's very saying, hey, here are the common good ways to do stuff. It's to nudge the people in the business all in the right direction without slowing them down.
Right. Okay. So I'm following you, and I'm picking up what you're putting down, and that I believe if you think about like in a typical organization these days, like everybody is a knowledge worker. Everybody has a data responsibility, at least in many organizations today, especially virtual
Yes.
organizations. They're everybody's working with data in one way or another, and so the need to be more powerful in doing that makes sense to me. The need to have some consistency, you've addressed that, and I think that there's a definite truth to that as well. And the other thing that I think about a lot is how can we federate the roles that are often in traditional, quote unquote, traditional organizations, centralized and become bottlenecks to the process existing. Because if everybody is a data worker, you're never going to have a large enough IT group to facilitate all of this in all these many different directions. And there may not even be any need to try to centralize that or coordinate it all, because they're all so specific in what they're trying to do with it that need for coordination can be done through some things like you're talking about with templates or what have you. So I'm following all of that pretty well. And I think that it starts to address, I guess the question that I would have then is around some of the other things that I think about as a person who grew up being that data engineer, data architect type of role, are things around how do you facilitate quality controls or testing, or some of the things that may not be as important to the domains or the functional users of the data that are trying to do a particular thing, but become important to coordinate across. So things like master data, things like that really should be the same across these different areas, that if left to their own devices, they would create different ones. Even though they would mean well, they would just be not aware that all these other groups are trying to do the same kind of thing. How do you facilitate that? Is that coming back to some of these templates, or how else might you serve that?
Right. So in this case, right, you have to. So the first thing is, can you identify a group that is the expert for this kind of data? In an organization, right, you have to identify who is an expert in what data or who's the authority. Now, is it that N groups are going to come together and in some master data management and agree or nail something? Or you might say that, you know what, this is the credit card business team. They understand their data. They should be the authority in this kind of data because they understand it's their business. And so what you really want is that team to own that data and say, we publish this to rest of the organization.
Okay.
And so that's where you need this publish subscribe mechanism, where this team goes and says, I publish this data set, and every time I want something, instead of reinventing the wheel, like what a lot of people do is they're going to go and say, I'll go back to the sources and recreate that, right? Why do people do that, right? Number one, they can't find this data set that they're looking for. Number two, when they find it, they don't know, can they trust it? And number three, even if they feel like this person is trustworthy, they don't know what the columns mean or how they were computed. Right? Sometimes you might have a column called IRR, which is internal rate of return. And and some data engineer went and did Google search, had a couple of beers, picked the third result, and that's not the formula I'm expecting. Right? I was expecting the first one. So basically, when these people publish data sets, you've got to be able to have, like I said, what is in this data set, right? And how fresh is it? How many other people are subscribed to it, right? So you're not gonna use some old dusty data set. Okay, it's been used, and another 5 teams are using it. That's great. You can look at the data quality metrics and see what kind of quality you're getting, and also something that comes from column level lineage and a lineage summary, right? Column level lineage kind of tracks the column all the way back to sources, and then you can get for every column the summary of how this column was computed. So now I know the formula as well. So now when I look at this data set, when I search for it, if that data set is there as a golden standard and there is some SLA, right? They're like, oh, we update this every day. Every day at 9 a.m., you're going to get an up-to-date copy, and this is all what you have. Now I can just use that data set. If I want one more column, I might just ping that team and say, hey, I am subscribing to that data set. Can you add this one column that I need? Right? So in that sense, right, trying to build this central thing is not scalable, right? Whereas if there are multiple different teams who each for their area of expertise publish the standard data sets, and it's very easy to search and it's very easy to subscribe, then that model works. Now there's some other subtle things, like let's say I am publishing customer data and I know 15 teams are consuming it and I want to change a column. Now, there used to be this term called impact analysis, right? I want to be able to say, okay, if I change this column, how many people downstream are using it? Will I break them? Right. So you kind of need to understand that connection as well. And so this to us seems like the only scalable way, where everybody who's an expert publishes, you search for the right thing, get the right result, the most used result, the most fresh result, and you start from that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. Because this takes away all the reasons why you were reinventing the wheel. You couldn't find it, you couldn't trust the data, you couldn't see the formula of how it was computed. You take those away, and so that's what we are moving toward. But it's a journey, I think, for organizations to get there. But decentralization to us is like the way to go.
Yeah, 100%. I'm on board with that approach. You had a lot of really great wisdom in that response, and I just want to emphasize a couple points. The whole publishing and subscribe thing, it's not like you invented that for data. That this is the API type of model that we've been using for applications for a long time, and
Yes.
I think it's the time is now to get that right for data also, because I think the other thing, if you go down this path of decoupled or loosely coupled publish and subscribe type of mechanisms, it also gets us to one of the points, and you mentioned data lineage, and I have a whole series of rants that I have been doing lately around data lineage, and one of it is and your publish and subscribe mechanism. I had never really made this connection until just now, and we'll see how this goes, but it's that lineage, I think, has been failing people left and right for at least a decade, as long as they've been trying to create lineage functionality. And it's because lineage often begins and ends at what happened. It's like you're trying to tell the joke and all you can spit out is the chicken crossed the road. And then somebody's like, but why did the chicken cross the road? That's the actual joke. That's what's meaningful in that whole thing. And it's like, no. The chicken crossed the road. That's all we need to know. It's an incomplete story. What we need is the actual why behind it. We need to actually understand what made this happen beyond the fact that, yes, this happened. And what you talked about is some of the things that you're capturing and that you're bringing forward allow people to start to understand, here's where this came from. Here's why this thing is here. Somebody has produced this. Here are the experts around it. Here's how it might correlate to other things that I might be interested in. And now you start to get a much more complete picture of the context of data or data sets or data sources or what have you, because you're not just looking at one isolated attribute. You're actually thinking about data in a much more flexible and holistic way that you can then apply to your particular circumstances and use effectively. And so I think this is where this is going. The other thing that I want to ask you to address in all of this is that I get sick of hearing, because I live in the data space, so I get sick of hearing a lot of the hot terminology that exists out there. And a couple of terms that I'm tired of hearing about right now are data mesh and data fabric, because I think that these things are embedded. Like, I don't need that to be a different thing. That just should be how we do work with data these days. I am fond, for whatever reason, I'm fond of this notion of a data as a product, which I think you are actually producing through this, the way you've structured it with Prophecy. Would I be correct? You're probably doing data mesh and data fabric as well as part of this, but I don't like those terms. I really want to hit at what matters. And to me, it's about, as a user of data, which is everybody in our companies now, like we were talking about before, can I get to the data that I need to use? Can I find it effectively? Can I use it effectively? And can I build on it effectively?
So actually, I see your reaction to data mesh and this, because the thing is, we had like a company who's considering us for data mesh, and we haven't talked about data mesh much on our product, and now they send us every website that mentions data mesh, and I'm like, this is not a data mesh, this is a streaming engine, but their website says data mesh, right? It's like, well, okay. So so as soon as some term gets hot, like everybody's trying to fight for the traffic, and it becomes meaningless. But I think you gave a couple of very interesting insights in this, right? And I'd like to kind of get that thread and kind of add a little bit to it. So first is data as a product. You have to treat data as a first class product. Otherwise, like you talked about master data management or this, it's like, no, data is a product. And like I said, a team who's an expert publishes that product. There's users of that product. And so that has to be the mindset, that data is a product. Now, the other thing that you mentioned, right, when you looked at publish, subscribe, and gave the example of an API, you see, that's the other thread is, in the data space, when there were these old tools, right, the old ETL tools or etc., they used to store pipelines as some XML in their system. Now, that doesn't work anymore. Like, software engineering has figured out collaboration and versioning and CI/CD and testing. It's like, now we are in the data world. I want you to use the visual tool. For God's sake, don't start writing code so that everybody's code looks different and the new person can't understand it. Just build it out of a bunch of Lego blocks, and it's self-documenting. You look at the pipeline, you're like, I see where the data started, I see where it ended up, and I can see at any point in the middle and see, okay, that's where I need to fix something. Now, the other, so visual is great, but what we've done is we said, okay, now visual converts to code on Git. That's number one. Now, then the second thing is we make it very easy to write unit tests by writing all the boilerplate. So it's just encouraging people to write tests because, some data engineer is going to leave, new person's going to come in, they're going to change something and break something. So now you got tests. And then the other thing that comes with that is versioning, right? So now what happens is as you look at lineage, because a lot of time, a column breaks.
Mhm.
And you're like, I don't know what happened. This is the state of the world and I'm observing it now. Now you go back to the lineage and say this was the last edit, right? And then you're like, okay, nobody changed this in the last week. Then you go back and say, did this data change? The person before that changed it. Yes, this person changed it. Now you have versioning. You're like, okay, what does this person change from to, and what did that person write the comment of what they were trying to do? So one is at first you can try to understand why this was changed. And if sometimes the comment's not going to be right, but you know the person to ping and you're like, hey, you changed this. Why did you change this? But I think this notion that you said of when you compare it to APIs, it's like not only does data have to become a product, but it can also use all the collaboration techniques and software engineering techniques, with visual tools. You can use all of that, and that kind of has a more robust process where you're thinking of it as a product you publish in the same way software people would publish an API, right?
Mhm.
And have many consumers. So it's kind of getting that machinery in place as well.
Yeah, I've long said that the metadata around the data is more important than the data itself in many cases. And what I'm thinking about right now is what you're discussing. Like it's about those tools for building the pipe. ETL is not that complicated, right? You
It is
move some
not.
data from place to place, you transform, you merge it, a couple things. There's only so many different functions. So I get why visual tools make that easier because there's only so many things you're doing to that data, right? And
Yeah.
so I like the idea of being able to do that. I like the idea of being able to make that happen. Now, what I think are just severely lacking are those coordinating functions, those things that are the Git equivalents or the equivalents that the application developers have been using for automated testing or CI/CD, or the kinds of things that make app development so rich in what you're able to accomplish these days. I mean, you can go and tap into a gaming engine and have a game developed in a couple of weeks. You can create some
Yes.
characters and create a story around it. Boom. That engine is a commodity to create all the functionality of the game. We don't have any of that on the data side. The data side is in the dark ages and has been for a long time. And that's where there's a rich opportunity to get this right. But the challenge has been is that our enterprises, and I think the challenge that we're facing in our enterprises, because everybody's working with data, everybody owns data, creating data, and our organizations are siloed vertically in ways that have not yet been well conceived. We've never worked with other groups very well, like the marketing group and the manufacturing group. They never worked together that well. But what we're saying is now we want all of our data to seamlessly move throughout the entire organization, and we just want it that way now. And we see things like Google and we're like, well, it's so simple, it should be fine. But that's not the case. It's actually super complicated underneath the surface to create a simplified user interface. And so
Yes.
I actually buy into this notion of publishing and subscribing and creating the right contextual awareness at each of the nodes for use of data to then over time be able to create this decentralized kind of federated world in which anybody can tap into any of the data that they need. And we got to stop controlling that centrally, because all we're doing is kind of hardening those silos versus
Yes.
being able to allow people to just work with the data as quickly and easily as they need to. Would you agree with what I just said? Because
No,
I
I
have a
completely
second part to
agree.
that.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said. Now, the other thing is it has to be incrementally. Like if we say everybody has to do this for it to succeed, never going to work. But
Right.
what this allows is it allows one team to start doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And then, one of their consumers, right? Somebody, another team they talk to who says, hey, I need this data to be like, hey, we are using this. Why don't you use this? And you'll do that. So from that value, right, you can slowly grow into an organization. But and then to your deeper point, it's like that's one of the reason I came here. I'm like these data tools, right? Because like you said, like I've worked in graphics, I've worked in gaming, right? I've seen those things. And that is some sophisticated stuff. And then
Yeah.
you listen to your podcasts and your books, and you're like, oh, these guys are making a reusable rocket, and the SpaceX rocket comes down and it lands on this barge in the ocean, and the water is shaking, and then you're like, oh, this is taller than an 8-story or 18-story building, I don't know how much. And I'm like, man. And then you go look at your data tools and you're like, what the hell? Like, but your point, like, it's very hard, because I think as a startup trying to solve this in the cloud,
Mhm.
we've run into a couple of challenges. First is, you go to the VCs. The VCs are like, okay, the Googles of the world are coding, the enterprises will follow Google, so everybody will write code from every data pipeline from scratch, and therefore that's the world. I do not fund you. Like, dude, like, no, like, why would you stay in this stone age? I mean, everybody has an good IDE, or you have Figma for designers. Like, what did data people do wrong? They don't get their own, powerful tools. So
Yeah.
I think that was a great challenge. And to that point, a lot of the startups didn't get funded. I think the second thing is that, just like you said, like, to make this one simple experience, you have to get N things together, each of them working well, and then the magic happens. And the
Mhm.
problem is, as soon as now, what happens is that you get a few million in funding. The earlier few days, few years, you've gotten larger rounds. But what happens is, you get a few million in funding. Then you go hire a team in Bay Area, right? And
Mhm.
the engineer costs an arm and a leg, right? Because Google on the other side is bidding, right? So is Facebook, so is Meta. It's like, and they're not building any, sorry to get random stuff into it, but they're not building any housing here. So everybody comes and asks for, like, I've never had anybody come to me and ask for under 200K, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of like absolutely, like, yeah. So now I put a small team to build a product, and quickly build a small piece, and the VCs are like, show me revenue, show me traction, because the days of promise are gone. It has to be up and to the right. And so I have to quickly run to the market with my tiny feature, and now I get VC funding. And then the VCs come in and say, that was great, now 3x the revenue next year. And guess what I'm doing? I'm just productionizing, hardening, and building sales on top. But my product is so tiny, it solves one small thing. But what the enterprise needs is this whole thing to work together. And so I think that has also been a challenge. It's like, nobody's funding the tools. And if you look at it, right, so to go a little bit longer on that, I'll stop shortly. uh, if you look at other things like Kafka, right, that came out of LinkedIn, right? VCs didn't fund it, it didn't get built here. Spark came out of Berkeley, right?
Mhm.
Snowflake was unique in the sense that there's a but that venture capital firm actually said, we are going to build this product, which is rare, right? Sutterhill is the only one who does this. But if you look at it, the data platforms have all been built in other companies, because they are willing to fund it and VCs are not. But then on the tooling layer, because all these companies have coders, they don't build good tools, right? Because they just like to write code. And so in tooling, where will the product come from, right? You're not going to get it from a big company. So for a startup, it's like nobody's going to fund much. So anyway, there's this complicated ecosystem thing why we don't have tools. But I think we've kind of built a big product and broken through, thank God. The good thing is, there's no competitors. When we go out to the market and people look at our product, and I'm like, what are you comparing it against? And they're like, nothing, there's nothing else there. Which
Yeah.
is surprising to us, because it's like, there's such a central data problem, everybody has it.
Yeah, well, and kind of to your point though, a lot of companies have come up with small fragments of an answer, but not a complete solution. And I completely agree around the challenges of the enterprise. I think there's been a lot of uh, high growth data type software vendors out there that I think don't necessarily understand the complexities of the enterprise Whereas many of them understand small and mid-sized businesses, definitely, 100%, they get those challenges. But to really scale up to the true complexities of an enterprise, I think that's where a lot of tools really struggle to turn that corner in a meaningful way, because I don't know that it is a transition between a mid-sized company to an you don't just add more features on top of the same product. I think it is a completely different product that serves the need of the enterprise versus what would be appropriate for small and mid-sized business. The problem is really hard to sell that first enterprise when you don't have a whole installed base to begin with. And so it is a bit of a paradoxical challenge there. But I really like, because this is something where the podcast gets listened to by entrepreneurs and people in enterprises and people in data and people in technology. And it's important for us to see, hey, all these tools that we're complaining that we don't have, there's real economic reasons and market-based reasons why that's difficult for those things to break through and become available to us. And so maybe we need to think about how we're approaching what we're trying to build so that we can hopefully have some support and growth in some of those things. So maybe some of the enterprise customers out there may be hearing this and say, oh, this is something that we may want to be diving into ourselves. The one question that I had...
Yeah, please go ahead.
Oh, no. Let's complete this thought, because I think this is really a good one. What were you going
to say? I
think
maybe some enterprises can start investing in, in products where, consortium of them or something, because like you said, right? I mean, when we went to some venture capitalists for our Series A, some of them had enterprise in their name. And when I told them, this is what we are doing, they're like, oh, this is not how startups are built these days. This is so 2 years ago. Okay, these days you go to mid-market and then you add features and then you get into enterprise product. You went and sold straight to the large enterprises, use them as design partners. That's not the right way to do it. These days you go to mid-market first. I'm just looking at it and saying, but the product is different. There is no transition from mid-market to enterprise. What are you talking about? And they're like, no, this is the latest fad. That's what we do. I mean, they don't call it the fad, but that's... Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're trying to figure out from their perspective where it is, and they're not experts in this either. And I think that's a challenge too that I've observed, is that the people that are building products, because they're bouncing between Bay Area firm to Bay Area firm, they don't necessarily know who their customer is. They don't necessarily know what it's like to be operating a large scale data environment with a big budget and big challenges in an enterprise. They may not have had that experience before. And so exactly. You can only project so much. So that can definitely be a challenge too. And those folks tend to not be living in the Bay Area. So it's going to be hard to find that kind of talent and awareness as well. Anyway, really interesting. Yeah. I had one other question before we went down that track that I do want to address, is that because I'm 100% on board with federation, publish, subscribe, API, and all of that. What about the stuff that's really sensitive? What about the stuff that you don't even want people to know we have to some extent? Like the secret formula for Coca-Cola is a famous one. Like, we don't necessarily want everybody to be able to look into all of that. So I'm sure you have some way of overlaying permissioning or security or what have you, but that is actually kind of in direct conflict with kind of a broad federation or what have you. But I know you only get so far in an enterprise unless you can say, hey, there are certain things that you can lock down. How do you manage that in a big kind of open environment like this?
So I think we have to manage that in a phased manner, for sure. So first, we are a startup, right? We do have multiple Fortune 500 and some Fortune 50 customers, but right now what we are saying is, so just to get an entry, we are like, okay, let's say you are using Databricks or Snowflake and you've used something for permissions, we'll just respect that. That's a good starting point. You figured out. But then the other thing is that when these data teams, right, but what we are working on is, one is being able to tag columns, number one. Number two is that when you look at these data products, it's like, I can't see all the data products that you are building. I can only go and say, I want to subscribe to this, and then you might allow me or might not allow me, right, to subscribe. Now, and then the question is, what permission do you have? What permission do I have? If that column in that data product is marked as encrypted and I don't have the access to see it, it should just show up as a garbled text, right, or whatever it is.
Yep.
But
Yep.
so the access control also has to be overlaid on top of the data. And we are not there yet, right? It's going to be a journey, because I think the first thing we'll do is make the underlying systems transparent. So that when you change something in our product, that goes and changes something in your underlying data platform. So your access control, okay, now once you can get it in one place, now it's like you need to have tags saying this column is PII, and then every time you compute something from it, across lineage flows the PII tag, which tells you what the restrictions are. And then when you access the data, you only get what you're restricted for. So now companies like Workday and all, who they manage some really complex HR data, who can see it, who cannot. So that mechanism is there. It just needs to be overlaid on top of this data infrastructure. It is a lot of work to get there, but it is doable.
Yeah, it is super, super complicated. And I have plenty of enterprise experience, and I know how overlaid those security and access environment controls can be. It is a hairy, hairy challenge, but it is definitely one that needs to be solved for this to get the kind of mass adoption. But I would agree, like, it's not the first problem you solve. There's plenty of data that doesn't hit that highly restricted category, but to get full coverage, you have to be able to address that. So I totally agree with like the relative prioritization, but it is if you're able to solve it, it is the $1 billion question, is like if you can solve that right, it will unlock this, and we will eventually be able to get to these tools that we so desperately need.
Yes, and the data space has so many unsolved problems, and all of them, if you go talk to the enterprises, to the complex businesses, they're all so important to them, right? And so it's just a space where we are like, oh, let's start here, and then like you don't know what to add on next, because every customer is asking for 5 different things, and then this like you just grow. But it's just like, the number of unmet challenges is huge. Hopefully, if we come back and talk in a couple of years, we'd be in a much better place, where we'd be like, oh, we figured out a whole bunch of stuff here. So that'd be real nice.
Yeah, well, and in the meantime, because we're about out of time today, so in the meantime, what's the best way for folks to find you and reach out to your organization after the show?
So you can go to prophecy.io, right? So that's the simplest thing is that's our website, right? Okay. You can go click a trial, just go try the product. If you're, let's say you're on Databricks or another data platform, you can just ask us for a demo. So just it's very simple. Just go to the website and say, I want to see the product. Raise your hand and say request a demo, and we'll come demo it to you and show you what we can do. So and there's plenty of content there to kind of get more familiar with the product.
Outstanding. Raj, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been an awesome conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Anthony. I loved it as well. Yeah.
And thank you all for joining us today. As always, you'll find more information and links in the show notes. Go to dataleadershiplessons.com to subscribe and check out our past episodes, and accelerate your journey with training at dataleadershiptraining.com. If you're enjoying Data Leadership Lessons and are interested in electric vehicles, check out my new podcast at electricdrives.us. We give you the information you need to transition to your electric vehicle future. And as always, stay safe during these unusual times, and go make an impact.